The moment does not begin with chaos or confrontation. It begins in stillness, inside a quiet studio where the lighting is soft. The tone is restrained, and Tamar Braxton sits across from an interviewer who lowers their voice instead of raising it, creating a space that feels intimate and disarming. And then the question is asked, not aggressively, not theatrically, but carefully. Are you aware of what really happened to you? And for a split second, nothing happens. No interruption, no clarification, just a pause that stretches long enough to make viewers lean closer to their screens. Because silence at that moment feels heavier than any accusation ever could, and Tamar does not rush to fill it. She does not dramatize or deflect. She looks inward, as if searching her memory in real time before answering with a sentence that instantly changes everything. She says she is not aware of what really happened to her. And that single admission lands like a shockwave, because it is not just an answer, it is an opening. An unanswered question presented to millions of people at once. And within seconds, it becomes clear this is no longer just an interview. It is a vacuum, and vacuums invite speculation. The internet immediately senses it. Viewers rewind the clip, slow it down, analyze her tone, her posture. The pauses between her words, and what unsettles people is not emotion but restraint. The way Tamar sounds almost detached, measured, as if she understands the weight of every word she chooses to say and every word she deliberately avoids. And that restraint is exactly what turns curiosity into obsession. Because how does someone wake up injured, require surgery, and still say they do not know what happened? How does something serious enough to alter your face and your life leave behind no clear memory? And as that question spreads across social media, the clip escapes its original context and becomes a viral moment, stripped of nuance and reposted with captions that imply far more than Tamar ever states. And before any names are mentioned, before any accusations are made, the narrative has already begun forming itself. Because in the absence of clarity, the public steps in. And by the time Tamar's interview finishes airing, the story has already moved beyond her words, transforming a quiet moment into the spark that ignites everything that follows. Once Tamar Braxton's interview circulates, the reaction does not explode immediately into outrage. Instead, it morphs into something quieter and more dangerous: analysis. Because the absence of detail creates an information vacuum that the internet is uniquely designed to fill. Viewers do not just watch the clip, they study it, rewinding her answers frame by frame, pausing on her expressions, screenshotting moments where her eyes shift or her voice softens, and replaying the exact phrasing of "I'm not aware of what really happened," as if repetition might unlock hidden meaning. And what stands out most is not what Tamar says, but what she leaves unsaid. There is no timeline, no description of events between the birthday party and waking up injured, no explanation of who was around her, and that lack of clarity becomes the center of the conversation. Because silence, when broadcast publicly, does not stay neutral, it invites interpretation. Social media timelines begin filling with theories, some sympathetic, others suspicious, some insisting trauma can erase memory, others arguing that confusion at this scale feels incomplete. And as those narratives compete, Tamar's restraint starts being read in multiple ways at once. To some, she sounds genuinely shaken and guarded. To others, she sounds careful, almost rehearsed, as if every word is being weighed against consequences not yet visible. And that perception fuels engagement. Creators break down the clip on YouTube. TikTok stitches isolate her pauses. Captions frame her silence as either vulnerability or strategy. And without Tamar adding clarification, the gaps grow wider. The story detaches from her original intent and takes on a life of its own, because in the digital space, ambiguity does not slow a narrative. It accelerates it. And soon people are no longer asking what happened to Tamar. They're asking who might be connected to what did not get said. Names begin surfacing not through accusation, but association. Memories of past appearances are resurfaced. Old photos and videos are pulled back into circulation. And assumptions start hardening into beliefs, all while Tamar remains publicly vague. And that is the turning point. because her silence stops being interpreted as protection and starts being framed as permission. Permission for the audience to speculate. Permission for commentators to connect dots she never explicitly drew. And by saying less, Tamar unintentionally allows the internet to say everything, transforming a lack of answers into the loudest part of the story and setting the stage for the pressure that follows. As more people absorb Tamar Braxton's account, the focus shifts from the interview itself to the reality of what she is describing. Because waking up injured, requiring surgery, and having no memory of how it happened is not a minor detail. It is the core of the unease surrounding the story. And the public reaction fractures almost immediately, with sympathy and skepticism existing side by side in real time. Some viewers rush to Tamar's defense, pointing out that trauma does not follow logic. That shock and emotional distress can erase memory, especially when an incident is sudden or violent. And they argue that demanding clarity from someone who admits confusion is both unfair and cruel. But others cannot reconcile the severity of the injuries with the absence of a timeline, because visible damage serious enough to require medical intervention usually comes with at least fragments of recollection. Sounds, movement, a moment before or after. And in Tamar's version, there is nothing but a blank space between leaving a birthday party and waking up hurt. And that blank space becomes the most unsettling part of the narrative. Not because it proves anything, but because it explains nothing. Viewers begin asking how an injury significant enough to alter her appearance could occur without any awareness of cause, and why no sequence of events has ever been publicly established. The lack of chronology raises questions that sympathy alone cannot quiet. And as clips of Tamar discussing surgery and recovery circulate, they are paired with captions that amplify confusion rather than clarity. Some expressing concern, others openly questioning plausibility. And this contrast fuels debate, because Tamar does not frame the injury as an accident, nor does she frame it as an attack. She leaves it suspended between possibilities. And that suspension creates discomfort, especially in an online environment conditioned to demand resolution. Without a clear timeline, viewers begin constructing their own, pulling from interviews, social media posts, and past appearances to fill in gaps Tamar never addresses. And every attempt to empathize is matched by a counterargument pointing out inconsistencies, like how quickly she returned to public life or how the language around the injuries shifted over time. And the result is a narrative stuck in limbo, where Tamar's pain is real, but the explanation remains elusive. And in that limbo, speculation thrives, because when damage is visible and memory is absent, the human instinct is to search for cause. And without Tamar providing one, the public keeps looking elsewhere, turning an injury into a mystery and setting the stage for scrutiny that grows louder with every unanswered question. When Tamar Braxton finally speaks about the night itself, she does not tell a story so much as she offers fragments. And those fragments are delivered with careful restraint. She says she went to a friend's birthday party, that everything felt normal, that she came home the way she normally would. And then the narrative stops. No escalation, no incident. No transition from celebration to crisis, just a clean break in the timeline that leaves the most important moments untouched. And what immediately stands out is not what Tamar includes, but what she excludes. There are no names mentioned, no locations clarified beyond the vaguest reference points. No explanation of who was with her at the end of the night, and by avoiding specifics, the focus quietly shifts away from the event itself and toward the people who were known to be in her orbit at the time. Because in the absence of detail, familiarity becomes suspicion. Viewers begin asking who the friend was, who attended the party, who left with her, and who did not. And that is where attention starts narrowing onto those closest to her that night, including Funky and Mendeecees, even though Tamar never directly connects them to what happened. Her language unintentionally does the work for her, because saying she came home normally suggests a baseline, a sense that nothing was wrong until suddenly everything was. And without naming anyone, it implies proximity without responsibility. And that implication becomes combustible online. Commentators point out that leaving names out does not remove them from the story. It simply invites the audience to supply them. And once those names start circulating, the narrative takes on momentum Tamar no longer controls. Old photos, videos, and public appearances are pulled back into focus. Not because they prove anything, but because they provide something solid in a story otherwise built on absence. And the more Tamar speaks in generalities, the more specific the internet becomes on her behalf. Her fragmented account creates a map with missing pieces, and people instinctively look to the figures who were visible in her life at the time to fill. Those gaps, which is how Funky's presence earlier that evening and Mendeecees' proximity in public settings suddenly feel relevant. Even without accusation and by choosing minimal detail, Tamar preserves her privacy, but she also redirects scrutiny outward. Because when the night is reduced to a party, a normal return home, and a blank space, the unanswered question is no longer what happened, but who was there when it did, and that question does not fade. It grows louder with every fragment left unexplained. Funky Dineva's name does not enter the conversation through accusation. It slips in through implication, and that distinction is what makes the fallout so damaging. Because Tamar Braxton never says he harmed her, never suggests he was responsible, never even places him at the center of the night. But she also never publicly clears him. And in the ecosystem of social media, silence functions like suggestion. Once viewers realize Funky was around earlier that evening, his proximity alone becomes enough for speculation to take root. Comment sections begin mentioning him casually at first, then repeatedly, until his name starts appearing alongside words like involved and knows more than he's saying. And as clips circulate without full context, assumptions harden into narratives. People remember Funky as outspoken, controversial, and unafraid of conflict, which makes him an easy character to cast in a story built on uncertainty. Bloggers and commentators begin framing questions around him, not because of evidence, but because of visibility. And that visibility becomes liability. Funky watches his name trend attached to implications he insists are false, accusations he says were never earned, and labels that paint him as dangerous without Tamar ever having to say so directly. And from his perspective, that is where the real damage occurs. Because while Tamar maintains plausible deniability by speaking vaguely, the public fills in the blanks in a way that centers him. And the longer that happens without correction, the more permanent the association becomes. Funky claims he reached out privately, not to argue or expose anything, but to ask for one thing only: a clear public statement that he did not harm Tamar. And according to him, that statement never came. Instead, the ambiguity lingered, allowing speculation to circulate unchecked. And the cost of that silence is not abstract, it is reputational. Funky describes being labeled a woman hater, a bad friend, someone capable of violence, all without a single direct allegation ever being made. And that disconnect fuels his anger, because from his perspective, Tamar's refusal to clarify becomes an act in itself. Not accidental, but convenient. And as weeks turn into months, the association sticks. Every time Tamar revisits the injury without naming names, Funky's name resurfaces by default. And what began as quiet analysis turns into a firestorm he says he never agreed to stand in, forcing him into a defensive position he believes could have been avoided with one sentence. And by the time he decides to speak publicly, the narrative has already formed around him, shaped not by accusation, but by omission, making his eventual response feel less like escalation and more like survival. When Funky Dineva finally goes live, the energy is not explosive, it is deliberate, controlled, and almost unsettling in its calm. Because he does not appear panicked or defensive, he appears prepared, as if he has spent months watching a narrative form around him and has now decided the cost of staying. Quiet is greater than the risk of speaking. And from the first moments of his live stream, it is clear he is not reacting emotionally, he is responding strategically. Funky addresses the audience directly and explains that the silence surrounding Tamar Braxton's injury did real damage to him. Not because she accused him, but because she did not protect him either. He says ambiguity became a weapon, not by design perhaps, but by consequence. And that while Tamar spoke in general terms, the public filled in the gaps with his name. His reputation and his character, Funky insists he was patient at first, believing clarity would eventually come. Believing that someone who called him a friend would not allow assumptions to metastasize unchecked. But as weeks turned into months, that patience turned into frustration. Because the story never corrected itself, it only evolved. And each retelling pulled him deeper into a narrative he says he had nothing to do with. Funky makes it clear that he did not go live to speculate about what happened to Tamar. He says repeatedly that he does not claim to know exactly what occurred after she went home. But what he does claim is certainty about his own actions and his own absence. And that distinction matters to him because, from his perspective, people began confusing not knowing with being guilty. And that confusion was allowed to spread because no one closed the door on it. Funky argues that ambiguity may protect one person, but it destroys another. And in this case, it destroyed his peace, his name, and his trust. He says he reached out privately, calmly, without threats, simply asking Tamar to say publicly that he did not harm her. And according to him, that request was ignored. Not denied, just left unanswered, which to him felt like a choice. And that is where his tone hardens, because Funky frames his silence as loyalty and her silence as indifference. He tells viewers that he understands trauma, understands confusion, but does not understand why clearing an innocent person was ever optional. And as he speaks, it becomes clear this is not about one interview or one night. It is about a line he believes was crossed when ambiguity was allowed to work against him, forcing him to speak now not to attack Tamar, but to reclaim a narrative he believes never should have included him in the first place. As Funky Dineva continues speaking, the narrative takes a sharp turn the moment he introduces a word that reframes everything. Inappropriate because up until that point, the story has hovered around confusion, memory gaps, and unanswered questions. But that single term shifts the focus from what happened after the night ended to what was happening long before it ever did. Funky explains that his discomfort did not begin with Tamar Braxton's injury. It existed months earlier in public, in plain sight, during moments other people brushed off as harmless. He describes Tamar and Mendeecees interacting in ways that made him uneasy. Not once, not privately, but repeatedly and openly. He points to music video shoots where their physical closeness stood out, group dinners where their attention never drifted far from each other, and public outings where boundaries, in his view, were visibly blurred. Funky stresses that what bothered him most was not gossip or rumor, but behavior he personally witnessed Tamar sitting on Mendeecees' lap, positioning themselves together regardless of who else was present, and interacting with a familiarity that, according to him, went far beyond casual friendship. And when Funky labels that dynamic extremely inappropriate, the weight of that word lands hard, because it is not framed as a misunderstanding or a misinterpretation. It is framed as a line he believed had already been crossed. That framing permanently alters how the story is received, because now the unexplained injury is no longer isolated. It becomes part of a broader context involving a relationship Tamar publicly downplays but Funky insists was obvious. He challenges Tamar's later claims that she barely knew Mendeecees, arguing that such denial contradicts what viewers themselves have seen in clips, photos, and appearances, and this is where public skepticism spikes. Because people remember the proximity, the ease, the consistency of their interactions. And Funky's account suddenly provides language for a discomfort audiences had not fully articulated before, by calling the relationship inappropriate. He moves the conversation away from accident versus attack and toward accountability and honesty. And that shift is irreversible, because even those who disagree with Funky now have to reconcile Tamar's denial with visible behavior. And from Funky's perspective, that denial is more damaging than any rumor. He argues that if the relationship had been acknowledged honestly, the rest of the story might not feel so fractured. But by refusing to name it for what he believes it was, Tamar leaves a gap that invites suspicion. And once the word inappropriate enters the narrative, it reshapes the entire conflict. Because the question is no longer just what happened that night, but what dynamics were already in motion before everything went wrong. According to Funky Dineva, the most critical part of the entire story does not happen inside Tamar Braxton's home. It happens before they ever reach it, inside the Uber ride that ends the night. Because that is where he says the dynamic shifted from uncomfortable to undeniable. Funky describes Tamar and Mendeecees sitting together in the vehicle. No longer subtle, no longer ambiguous, but openly intimate. With Tamar allegedly sitting on Mendeecees' lap and the two of them kissing as if no one else was present. And he says that moment made a decision for him without any argument or confrontation, because from his perspective, whatever was unfolding between them was not something he wanted to witness or be associated with. Funky explains that when the Uber arrived at Tamar's house, he did not follow her upstairs. Not out of exhaustion or distraction, but intentionally. He says he chose to remove himself completely because the behavior he had just seen made him uncomfortable enough to draw a firm boundary, and that choice becomes the cornerstone of his entire defense. Funky is careful too. Entire defense. Funky is careful too. Repeat that he does not claim to know what happened after Tamar went inside, and he emphasizes that point deliberately, because his argument is not built on speculation, it is built on absence. He insists that physical presence is not subjective. It is binary. Either you were there or you were not. And he says without hesitation that he was not. He claims he got into his own car and went home, leaving Tamar with Mendeecees and others he says were still present. And in Funky's framing, that decision matters more than memory ever could. Because memory can blur, trauma can erase. But presence is fixed in time, and that is why he repeatedly returns to the Uber ride when explaining his side. Supporters argue that this detail explains why Funky speaks with such certainty about what he did not do, while critics question whether the timing is convenient. But regardless of where people land, the focus of the conversation shifts. It is no longer centered on Tamar's lack of recollection. It is centered on who remained with her after Funky left, and by emphasizing his departure, Funky redirects scrutiny away from himself and toward those he says stayed behind, without naming outcomes or assigning blame. And that redirection reshapes the entire narrative. Because if Funky truly removed himself before anything went wrong, then the responsibility to explain what happened next does not belong to someone who left. It belongs to those who did not, and that is why this moment becomes the central factual anchor of his account, transforming the story from one about memory loss into one about presence, absence, and the consequences of who was still there when the night crossed its final threshold. Months after the initial incident, Tamar Braxton chooses to revisit the story publicly, appearing on a radio show and framing herself as the generous friend who threw a birthday celebration for someone who later betrayed her, carefully avoiding naming anyone while subtly implying a sense of betrayal. And in doing so, she reignites a tension that many thought had cooled the narrative, which had begun as confusion and concern over an unexplained injury, now shifts into a new phase of scrutiny and speculation. Because by reopening the story without clarifying key details, she allows assumptions to proliferate once again. Funky Dineva watches this unfold with alarm, interpreting her selective framing not as a recounting of events, but as a strategic move to control the story while leaving him vulnerable. And that perception is intensified when legal pressure enters the picture. Tamar's legal representatives issue warnings to Funky, signaling that continued discussion could have consequences. But Funky perceives these warnings not as protective measures for Tamar or others involved, but as confirmation of a broader strategy, a deliberate attempt to manage public perception and silence anyone who might challenge her narrative. He argues that the letter does not address the unanswered questions about who was present, what happened, or why certain actions were taken instead. It shifts the focus to the risk of speaking, reinforcing his suspicion that the narrative was designed to remain ambiguous. Funky explains that the legal intervention validates his concerns about selective disclosure, because it emphasizes control over clarity and, to him, that control is more significant than any attempt to shield privacy. He frames the situation as a power struggle, where the ambiguity surrounding Tamar's account allows the internet and, by extension, her audience to speculate freely while he is expected to defend himself. And he makes it clear that he interprets the reopening of the story as a calculated move to reignite suspicion and redirect attention, rather than an honest attempt to provide context. And in Funky's view, this combination of vague storytelling and legal warnings creates pressure, a psychological leverage, forcing him to respond in order to protect his reputation. Rather than merely reacting to events, ultimately, the story that began with an unexplained injury now evolves into a complex interplay of narrative control, strategic silence, and legal maneuvering, where Funky insists the stakes are no longer just about memory or truth, but about who controls perception, who frames the discourse, and who remains accountable when key details are left deliberately unspoken, setting the stage for a confrontation where public attention, legal threats, and selective storytelling collide in a high-stakes battle over narrative authority. By the time the situation reaches its current climax, the story of Tamar Braxton, Funky Dineva, and Mendeecees spirals into a collision of narratives where nothing is straightforward and every word pause. An omission becomes a battleground because on one side, Tamar speaks in memory gaps, emotion, and selective disclosure, claiming she does not remember the events that led to her injury, presenting herself as a victim of circumstance. While on the other, Funky counters with timelines, presence, and detailed observations, insisting that what he witnessed and the decisions he made provide clarity in a story deliberately left ambiguous. And this clash of perspectives transforms what might have been a simple explanation of an incident into a public examination of accountability, intent, and narrative power. Funky frames his refusal to be quietly blamed as a necessary stand, arguing that when ambiguity is weaponized, silence is not neutral, it is a force that shapes public perception and can inflict reputational harm. And Tamar's continued vagueness only magnifies that force, leaving audiences to interpret motives and behavior without guidance. As the tension escalates, legal interventions and past interactions are added to the mix, amplifying the stakes and further complicating the narrative. Viewers are left navigating a labyrinth of half-statements, selective recollections, and implications, each side insisting on the validity of their perspective while undermining the other. And as these two accounts collide, the internet becomes both jury and witness, replaying interviews, dissecting body language, and questioning consistency because no external confirmation exists, only competing versions of truth. And Funky emphasizes that presence is the only indisputable fact he can assert. He was either there or he wasn't. While memory, emotion, and omission create a haze that allows speculation to flourish. Meanwhile, Tamar's narrative continues to hover in the ambiguous space between clarity and evasion, making her intentions unclear, and the unresolved questions multiply. Who was there? Who remains silent? Who benefits from the gaps in the story? And who holds responsibility for what occurred when the memory is incomplete and in this charged environment? The final standoff is not about proving what happened, but about controlling the interpretation of events. Because once the story becomes public, perception itself becomes reality. Funky's insistence on detailing his version collides with Tamar's strategic silence, leaving the audience as arbiters of belief, forced to choose which account feels credible, which is incomplete, and which speaks to motive, behavior, and accountability. And by the end, the story no longer revolves solely around injury or relationships. It revolves around the power of narrative, the cost of silence, and the unrelenting question hanging over everyone in a world of selective disclosure. Who ultimately controls the truth, and what does that control mean for the reputations, friendships, and public perception of those involved?